Welcome, everybody, to episode 30 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm here once again with my comrade-in-arms, Bill Roggio. Bill, say hi to everybody.
Hello, everyone.
We, once again this week, have one of our favorite guests on the show. Craig Whiteside has decided to join us again. He's been gracious with his time before. Earlier, you'll remember on one of the earlier episodes of this podcast, he came on to talk about his excellent new book, The ISIS Reader, and we did a pretty extensive conversation or discussion of that book. And today, Craig has come back. He's going to talk about these new documents that were released by the U.S. government that basically deal with interrogations of the jihadi who would go on to become the emir of ISIS. And the files are fascinating. They're very interesting. Of course, you have to sort of very carefully analyze them, and there's nobody better to bring on the show to do that than Craig. So, Craig, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. Always enjoy your stuff. And you guys are part of this story, if you know it or not. You probably know it.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been following this for a while, so a lot of the details here sort of piqued our curiosity, and we saw this story come out, and it was one of those things where we hoped it would get a lot more attention, but of course in this busy sort of news world, it was something that didn't get the attention it deserved. And of course, the headline that came out of these files was that the new emir of ISIS, he's now known as Abu Ibrahim al-Qureshi, was in fact a snitch, that he was somebody who actually gave up intelligence on his comrades in the field there in Iraq. This is something that obviously should be damaging to his credentials or his bona fides in the jihadi ranks. But Craig, why don't you walk us through this a little bit? Why don't you tell us about what the files are, where they came from, how they were put out, and then, sir, we'll get into what you take from them.
Sure. And I mean, it's true that these interrogation reports are very, very detailed. Some of them are summaries, some of them are in his own words, and they do tell his side of the story. In just the first three interrogations, there's actually 66 interrogations total, and they've only the U.S. government's only released these three, the first three, and we're not sure why. And
so you would join us, Craig, in asking and wanting the U.S. government to release all of them, right? That's sort of our shtick. Yeah, you
guys have pushed for that in other venues, other people, and certainly that's something that I think we can all get behind is further releases of these documents, and I'm not sure why the rest haven't been released, but it's early 2008. He was captured in Mosul. In Milton's description in CTC Sentinel, he actually can link it to an actual article written documenting, quote unquote, the second highest leader of AQI captured in Mosul on that particular day in early 2008. So there's a lot of good corroboration you can get from open source reporting on it. And I think the interrogations talk a lot about individuals that whose names and faces he identifies as part of what appears to be pretty normal interrogation techniques by an American military that's pretty savvy at this by 2008. They already seem to know who everybody is in the organization, his local organization, including his his superiors. And, there's some question whether or not he realizes that, lying at this point would be probably counterproductive. But he definitely gives up a lot of information and names, and it's just hard to know like how normal or typical that is amongst folks, particularly ones that are going up against an American military by early 2008 really does understand counterinsurgency, kind of like we talked about last time, kind of figured out a lot of different aspects and knows this organization pretty decently by now.
And just to clarify, I should have led off with this. These files are put out through the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. CTC did some analyses. You guys put out some excellent write-ups of this stuff. You mentioned one of them, and I think it was the CTC Sentinel, right, Craig? I think that's which is an excellent publication. We really enjoy reading it. And we think they do a great job under Paul Cruikshank and his team there and putting out excellent analyses. We highly recommend it. And so these files, we've been going through them too, not nearly the depth that you have, but there's a lot of interesting sort of little tidbits that come out here. And of course, so we're talking about the new emir of ISIS. This is a guy who, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in October of last year in a raid in Idlib province in northwestern Syria, a very curious hiding spot for him. I don't think anybody really thought he'd be there, of all the places in Syria, but he was. And there's some interesting details around what he was doing at the time, which we're hoping to explore in the future. But so Baghdadi's killed in this raid, and his replacement is named as Abu Ibrahim al-Qureshi. Now, these files deal with this guy, based on his full name, which was given back in the days as Muhammad Saeed Abdurrahman al-Mala. So that's his full name in Iraqi. Now, Craig, there was a lot of mystery about this guy when he was first named as Baghdadi's successor, right? There was a lot of confusion not a lot, but some confusion over who exactly he was and what his biographical details were. Maybe if you had a comment on that, and even some confusion over his ethnicity and sort of where he fits into sort of the whole sort of complex matrix of ethnicities within Iraq.
Yeah, this is that's a big topic to tackle because this group, as you both know, kind of prize anonymity for their leaders, which is kind of it's counterintuitive for most insurgent leaders throughout history. Some of them are even iconic and famous to this day, long after their death, and that's part of this cult of personality. But the Islamic State almost operates off of reverse cult of personality, which is we don't want one. Like the thing is the caliphate. You're going to pledge to an individual emir, but to them, it's almost more important to the caliphate. Now, that could be a defense mechanism for the constant leader targeting that we do, or it's just something that they feel is important. But because of that, they didn't announce his real name. They didn't announce Al-Mala's name, and it was there was a debate about whether it would be Al-Mala, who people know about as being in the top leadership of the Islamic State prior to Abu Bakr getting killed, or if it was somebody else. There was another key leader that was there was debating who it would be. And so that was one of the debates. A lot of people didn't think it was Al-Mala because as it says in the interrogation reports, he's from a city near Talafar, northern Iraq, that's almost 90%, I think, Turkmen and 10% Arab. So a lot of people doubted that he could claim that Qureshi title that they introduced him as, Abu Ibrahim al-Qureshi. So, that was also another controversy. There were even reports that he was a former Ba'athist, because it tends to be almost a link people make. He did have military, in reality, he did have military time, but it was as a draftee, enlisted.
And when we say Qureshi, what we're talking about is that they're claiming he has descent from the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad. So that's the whole idea, is that basically this guy is got the right bona fides in terms of politics and religion in order to be the Caliph, and that's the whole idea. And that's why the Turkmen issue, that's why it became a possible sort of issue to explore, because if he did have a Turkmen identity, then that lineage becomes even more doubtful. But now I always think with this type of stuff, who knows what the real lineage is there. I have my family, I have a very old genealogy in my family, and I can tell you going through it that there's all sorts of little divots that you don't, there's some fudge factor even in a well-documented genealogy such as my own, so who knows. But in any event, that's where this issue arose. Now in the files, it identifies him as Arab. So it's sort of, was taken.
He self-identified, I think, in his interrogation as Arab. So that kind of leans to, I think the Islamic State, in selecting him, however difficult the period of time is for them, strategically, I think they take this Qureshi tie thing pretty seriously. Abu Bakr claimed it, and his tribe had a much clearer lineage than this guy.
Yeah.
And Abu Umar before him claimed it as well. Yeah. And then Zarqawi didn't, which kind of makes you wonder, when we killed Zarqawi in 2006, does that kind of open them up for, being able to have a leader with this particular tie and then continue this kind of leadership criteria that they've had? All three of them, well, Abu Umar really wasn't religiously trained, but Abu Bakr obviously had a PhD from Baghdad University. And then the interesting thing that came out of the Mala documents is he had just graduated from Mosul University's Islamic Studies College, I think getting a master's degree there in that. And that kind of gave him that religious training that is kind of parallel to Abu Bakr. So he almost, mimics or imitates that same career pattern which kind of tells us something about the organization and how it does business in this regard.
You bring up the Zarqawi succession. I mean, the interesting thing there was that Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, who was Zarqawi's replacement, of course, he didn't have that pedigree either. And of course, it was under his leadership that they declared the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006, and they had Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, who did claim that lineage, sort of as the new head of the Islamic State of Iraq. So they sort of got around that. They had to get around that. Even with Zarqawi's successor, they had to sort of pick somebody who, was going to be the appropriate sort of lineage for what they wanted to claim there. So looking through this file, you got that, you pull right out that the fact that he had a master's degree in Quran science from Mosul University. He's fairly young. I mean, he's somebody who's about 44 now, I guess. Looking at his file, young 30s then. He's a portly fellow at 5'8", 223. He wasn't missing the buffet line in the jihadi camps. I could say that as a fellow portly fellow. So Yeah. I actually that's a little joke, folks, because I foregoed my deadlift session so we can record this late on a Monday night with Craig, which. But that's neither here nor there. Bill's getting a chuckle out of that. So let's get into a little bit more about this guy's background and the structure here in Mosul. Bill, I know you were looking at these files and you were looking at the structure and what this has to say about how the Islamic State evolved in Mosul. I'm sure Craig has a ton of thoughts on that. Maybe you guys want to sort of explore that a little bit through these files.
Before we get into that, Craig, I was curious, when did the U.S. government, when were they actually aware of that that al-Mala was actually the emir of the Islamic State? How soon after Baghdadi's death was the U.S. government certain that it was him?
Ooh, that's a good question. I thought it was pretty immediate, which gave me the perception at the time, and this is a year ago, and actually I could be wrong on this, but I think the U.S. government figured it out through some technical means, and they were onto it pretty early. And most people, they just didn't give any kind of supporting evidence for this particular claim. We talked about on the last show how they got the last one wrong. They thought Abu Umar was fake, and that it was really, obviously Abu Hamza had a large role to play all the way to his death. But one thing these document release does do is it helps confirm who al-Mala is, if he actually is. The Islamic State actually still has not put the two of those together. The U.S. government and the United Nations and a couple other folks have come out and said they're pretty sure that it's him.
Yeah, we had Deb and Fitton Brown on last week for an extensive conversation. Hopefully we won't keep you as long as that, Craig. That was an hour and 40 minutes. So, but he was pretty confident. He said his team had confirmed pretty early on that al-Mala was in fact the new emir. So they were pretty confident in that pretty early on as well, that was Baghdadi's successor.
Yeah, the reason I asked this, you would think it would be prudent to immediately, for the U.S. government, for the United Nations, to identify him and release this information. It just puzzles me. It's 1 year later. What sort of, other than historical, it just would have helped discredit him in a lot of ways to say, hey, Islamic State, your new emir is a snitch, and here's our interrogation sessions with him. I'm sure there's tapes out there that exist and his image, and it just always bothers me, the lack of our failure in information operations like this, and it just.
You're right, and compared to the Islamic State's information operations, which is pretty legendary at this point, they have just as much bureaucracy as we do, and yet they produce products. And for us, my guess is that it was a long period of uncertainty within, let's say, the U.S. government on what to do with this information, how to utilize it correctly. Does it end up accidentally blowing back on you? And then, as bureaucrats, that's not what you want. And eventually, they really thought, I think originally, that they were going to discredit Mala on the Turkmen. And then, again, depth of knowledge of societies, and also Tom's point that genealogy and ancestry is pretty complex for most families. Never mind, Arabs or even Turkmens or Arabized Turkmen in the Middle East, and the most folks who have knowledge in the area. I think Hassan came out pretty early and was like, there's plenty of ways that he could be a Qurayshi and be from that particular area and that tribe. As a matter of fact, it's not as clear as Abu Bakr's was or Abu Umar's, who they have kind of tribes that are very much visible as descendants of the Prophet or lineage from the Prophet. So, but why it took so long? It's pretty. We still haven't learned that. We've got to get out quickly, and like you said, it's kind of buried in the news now, but it might have been much more effective at the time.
Yeah, I mean, and if we were forward thinking, we would have answered these questions long ago. We have all these interrogations, we have all these profiles. I'm not going to belabor this point. I just find it shocks me that, I guess at that point, 18 years into this war, that we still haven't figured out how to use information that we've obtained on the battlefield and interrogations and how to take this, use this, and discredit our enemies. And make no mistake, I think it would have, whatever negatives may be out there, there certainly had to be positives to labeling this guy and proving that he's a snitch to his fellow jihadists, because someone like him with his credentials, with his background, and now rising to the top level of leadership. I mean, look, no one likes snitches. I don't care if you're an American or you're a jihadist, whatever you are. That's sort of the lowest of the low, and I think it would have had some sort of impact.
So am I reading this file correctly, Craig, that it seems like he had some proficiency in speaking English? Is that right? At the time he was captured? I think that's what it says, languages and proficiency. And then after EN, it has a P in parens, which I'm assuming means proficient, and so
it's hard to tell how proficient that was. Yeah, I really couldn't make much out of it, and they didn't really go into depth on that, but it'd be interested to see. Yeah. I mean, he was educated, like I said, he was educated, and he was educating himself. That's one of the questions we had is, during, anywhere from 2005 to 7, which is a pretty critical time in Mosul, as Bill knows, I'm sure he was there. He's in school, and so you wonder if that's not part of a plan or some kind of grooming or even some other actions. There's a lot of other things going on, and yet he's pretty dedicated to school. But ironically, that's exactly Abu Bakr too. Abu Bakr's getting his PhD during this time period, so it also makes you wonder, there's a lot of people are asking people to pick sides at this particular point or get on this team or that team, all the different teams that are out there. And so, but he keeps his cards pretty close, and he did as well with his language capabilities. I've not really been able to see anything beyond what you just mentioned.
And Craig, to your point about I was in Mosul in I want to say it was March, April 2008, and I remember driving by Mosul University, and I was with some U.S. military transition teams or training teams. And so we were obviously with Iraqi army units, and the Iraqis, while driving by the mosque, would point to it and say, a lot of bad things are happening there. And obviously, guys like Amala were studying.
Now, is that the same mosque that's mentioned in the files, Bill? Because I mentioned, Imam at Al Furqan Mosque. I don't know much.
I'm not certain. I
couldn't find it. It's pretty small. It's a pretty small mosque, but it's near the university. So and pretty close.
The whole university area at that time was considered to be enemy territory. That entire area, they just basically said only bad things came from there, was the view of the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police in the area.
You look at the Anbar insurgency study that the army released last year. It's in Anbar, of course, but they do the same thing in Anbar University in Ramadi.
Yep,
it's
exactly.
And the Islamic State, the early Islamic State has a plan to influence not only its curriculum, but to recruit people out of it, particularly for critical areas that they're short of, which is Sharia. They don't have the bench. They don't have Sharia experts. They didn't have them at the time. They had to develop their own.
And Craig, that's what he says. He joins the Islamic State in 2007, right? Almost immediately, he rises to the top as a top Sharia official in the group, does he not?
That's what it says, and that's another one that kind of stretches people's it stretched all of our kind of, or it triggered our suspicions. Like how we think he might have had an association with the group long before. I feel like that's something that I'm coming to understand, is that the group had a lot of they had associations with people and allowed people to do what they were going to. And to kind of cooperate, collaborate, do joint operations together. But then after a while, particularly once the Islamic State declares itself, I think the windows start shortening, and they're like, okay, yeah, it's time to get off the fence now. They're using leverage like that, and I think he gets caught up in that. But it's really interesting. He joins at a time where the organization as itself is about to go off the cliff. Right, a couple months later, the Sawa is full force. They're running for the hills, and yet Mosul's different. You probably felt that at the time,
Yes.
but Mosul. And so there's a lot of weird kind of portends that relate to today now, or at least 2014 when the group kind of consolidates power.
And just a little backstory on that, where Mosul was in 2008. I would say by late 2007, much of Anbar, Baghdad, Salahuddin province, and large areas of Diyala were the Islamic State of Iraq's insurgency was largely suppressed. By March 2008, when I arrived in Mosul, that was the sort of the last hotbed where the Islamic State of Iraq still controlled territory. So yeah, Craig's absolutely right. I mean, you went through Baghdad to go through Baghdad to embed into Mosul. It was just a different feel in Baghdad and other parts of Iraq than when you got to Mosul, where it was a slugfest. I mean, I was at a military base in Iraq at 2 days prior to one of the largest suicide attacks in Iraq that was actually carried out by a Guantanamo Bay detainee. So yeah, it was a very interesting time. The Islamic State of Iraq was fighting for its life and fighting for control of the insurgency to maintain its relevance in Mosul.
Yeah, and that's when he joins, right? He becomes a dedicated member at like this critical juncture where people are deserting the group. People who are kind of like, this is not for me. And so I think that tells you a lot about him, I think.
Sure.
So let's get a little bit into the sort of how they set up shop in Mosul, because the files really, if you put together the sort of connective tissue here over time, one of the things that I was talking about just a couple of weeks ago with somebody was, when they declare the Caliphate in Mosul in 2014, this is not an accident, right? I mean, this is not like they just picked Mosul out of a hat at the last second. There are a lot of historical reasons for picking Mosul, but there are a lot of there's a whole history of the Islamic State organization in and around Mosul, and one of the things we've been pulling out of the files recovered from bin Laden's compound were some biographies of Zarqawi that were included in the compound, including an audio file that was a biography that was recorded by somebody who knew Zarqawi, and says, and basically points to Zarqawi very early on laying down some roots in Mosul himself, and organizing the proto-insurgency there. There's a long story there, and as I read through these files, it's just striking to me when you look at the infrastructure that they're putting in place, the administrative infrastructure, the proto-governance infrastructure, the Sharia infrastructure for the Islamic law that they're going to try and implement, and why a guy like this becomes so important to them. You could see very early on they're laying out the structure for a state. Like they actually meant when they said they're the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006. They meant it. They were laying out the infrastructure to try and build a state. Maybe talk a little bit about how you view that in Mosul and anything we can tell about how that evolved over time from this point on. Yeah,
I mean, again, I'd welcome people to go to the CTC website and pull they actually have the actual interrogation reports there, the raw summaries, and in some cases own words, and you can kind of see what Tom's talking about. There's the structure itself is still Al-Qaeda structure. It's really interesting, kind of as you guys have talked about in the past. It's still Al-Qaeda structure as far as the different stovepipes. But, the levels, how they're layering down into Mosul, and then there's a northern region, and then there's the top leadership, and all of it's identical all the way down. And they're constantly filling these positions as they get taken off the battlefield by the United States or even other rivals. And so that's pretty impressive. You can see that. I think that story is well known. And then, of course, the Islamic State's tremendously famous for once they take over Mosul, is then expanding that structure into, 16 different departments that have a lot to do with population control and services, providing services for the population, all that other stuff. And it all starts here in 2007, like you're saying. There's 2 points I'd pull out that most people, like I say, I welcome people to see for themselves, is they're not that long either. There's lots of information in them. But one thing that he's trying to do is they're already trying to kind of cross-pollinate some of the branches, and in the wire stick diagrams, it's just like military people, it's the Sharia people here, the administrative people here, and so on. And yet he's trying to get Sharia people into each of the different wings so that the military has Sharia people in it. The security people have to, because they're going around killing people, they actually have to have Sharia people there to kind of make judgments on whether or not whether or not how much of an apostate these people are. So this is really critical. It's almost like embedding a JAG officer with a SEAL unit downrange that's doing targeting, and they have to kind of see if it fits authorities or authorizations for the use of force. So there's this kind of weird dynamics going on. But he's also doing it in the criminal enterprise. He's going through saying, well, we can, this is legit to steal because it belongs to apostates. No, these are good Sunni Iraqis, and therefore we can't take money from them other than normal taxation, right? We can't just abscond with the entire thing. I think when he's captured, he actually has a bill of sale for thousands of pounds of wheat, which he's involved in because the Sharia guy is also involved in the criminal enterprise, it's kind of fascinating how they're cross-pollinating. And then you can see the seeds for what eventually becomes in the Islamic State.
Yeah, Craig, when I read that, I almost thought of like commissars in the Soviet army in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, really they're exactly, outside of the communist ideology, but it's very much like that. And I'm working on a project for that, but you can see that the French did it as well during the French Revolution. They called them representatives on mission, and that was to make sure that they were ideologically correct. And these guys do it as well. And so, that's a pretty interesting observation that I've been digging into very recently. So it's kind of funny. The other interesting thing is there's still all of this talk of hierarchy, and the structure, sometimes gives a perception that the Islamic State's this huge, massive bureaucracy like ours, right? Like the U.S. government. But it's not, because it's constantly changing. It's constantly not just the people, but the structure is actually changing constantly. And like, for example, in these documents, he's the Sharia of Mosul, but they stick Al Furqan Media, which is the top level media outlet, they stick it under him he's supervising it. So that we can't even comprehend, the U.S. government sticking its stuff here in NPS and saying, hey, you guys know what you're doing out there on InfoOps. Why don't you guys supervise messaging for the top leadership? Why don't you guys screen the president's speeches going on? It's an absurd analogy, but that kind of flexibility is just kind of interesting to me. And it's really interesting from where they come from. I mean, their media unit is the most centralized part of them. And yet they stick it under the future Caliph in Mosul.
And Al Furqan is still the central media hub for the group to this day. Yeah. I mean, you just released a message from Al Furqan in the last 24 hours, Yeah. I mean, something we're processing and get up at Long War Journal here, get my act together. But, they're still pushing out messages, regularly through Al Furqan. Now, Bill, you had something you wanted to weigh in there with a little bit on the structure, or you want to go through this a little bit more?
It was just a quick question. It's this is really nerdy. I think only you, me, and Tom will probably appreciate this, and maybe 3 other people out there. So I noticed that in their documents they talk about the right side and the left side of Mosul.
Well, that's where I was going, Bill. So this is good.
Okay. Good. Yes, fellow nerds think alike. What can I say? And the U.S. military and the Iraqi military are actually organized along the same structures. Obviously, we didn't call it left and right. We called it East and Western Mosul. I have a theory about this. I think I know the answer, but I'm curious as to what you think about that. Why was Mosul? What was it about Mosul that made it organizationally sound to divide it in half?
That's a good question. I don't really. I know that's always been divided that way and talked about this way, but I don't actually know why, other than my guess would be ethnicities. The Kurds are on one side, but then again, the university is over there, and that's where he kind of, when he was in Mosul, hung out, apparently, both at the mosque and for his studies. Whereas, the traditional, is the right side of Mosul, which is the older part of the city, and tended to be where I think the the Islamic States, was able to operate a little bit more free than from. But I don't know. That's good.
Yeah, with the American and the Iraqi side, the Kurdish was stronger on their side of the city. So you had the two primarily Kurdish units. Actually, there were almost predominantly Kurdish units. There were 2 brigades of that division were based there, and then the Sunni / Shia predominantly units were on the right side. I always felt that the Kurdish influence played a role in the Islamic State's organization as well. So now, just curious if you had any insight into that.
It probably also, from what I understand, well, I've heard from a number of people, and this is just an opinion, that it was Kurdish overreach in Mosul that kind of also helped set the conditions for things like the fact there's never a Sawa, there's never an awakening in Mosul, right? I mean, it's everywhere else. Diyala, which is a crazy nut house, Anbar, of course, even Northern Babel and Saladin have awakenings. Nineveh, well, there was one town, but
it did, but it was inconsequential. I remember seeing reports of it, and they tried to puff it up as being important, but it wasn't. It was either the Kurdish units, and I remember driving around, and the Kurds, and as you mentioned, the overreach, they were displaying their flags at their own checkpoints and not the Iraqi army flags. And I remember turning to the American commanders that I was with. I was like, man, that can't be good. That's got to be helping the Islamic State of Iraq. That's got to be pissing off the Iraqi generals, and so yeah, a lot of tensions up there in the north. A lot of divisions that really played into Al Qaeda's hands, Islamic State of Iraq's hands at that time.
You could see in the files too a couple of other things. So first of all, when he starts sort of giving details, they're showing him pictures, obviously, of his fellow members of the ISI. Islamic State of Iraq, and he starts identifying them. He gives a lot of details about Al Furqan Media, so he clearly knows these guys who are running it, right? I mean, he's identifying them by photos, so it's obviously a piece of intelligence that says, this guy's not just boasting about his ties to Al Furqan Media and his role here, and it's just a very interesting detail to see. The other thing is you could see that they're already reshuffling a little bit. They talk a little bit about transferring personnel, including Abu Abdullah al-Shami, who was the wali of Mosul. Interesting with his nom de guerre, obviously he's not a native, or at least the nom de guerre implies he's not a native, obviously, of Mosul, which we know. And so that's an interesting factoid about him, and they're moving things around. But you can see, too, that some of the guys he identifies had already supposedly moved to Syria. That some of these guys had moved across the border and operating in Syria, according to what he was telling interrogators. And I thought maybe it's sort of another interesting sort of detail that stuck out to me reading through these files, because, again, we know from other sources that there are logistical pipelines going through Syria at this point into Iraq. Bill liked to say, early on in the Syrian war, that basically what happened was that pipeline turned back against the Assad regime. Basically it was something that General Petraeus, you could see in leaked cables, was warning the Assad regime about, saying that this was going to come back to bite them. The fact that they were hosting all this in Syria going into Iraq. But you can see other personnel in these files mentioned are people who are living across the border in Syria, allegedly, in these files. And you can see the reshuffling, and there's just a lot of other nitty gritty details about the personnel. And I was wondering if you had anything that you wanted to share about that.
Yeah, the individual you're talking about was relieved from being the wali of Mosul, and went back to Syria, which is where he was from originally, if I remember that timeline right. And the interesting reason it has to do with infighting, going back to what we were talking about earlier, is a bunch of Mujahideen army, which was a rival group of the Islamic State, somewhat Islamized, and 4 of them had joined the Islamic State as part of the creation of the Islamic State of Iraq, and this supposed merger of tribes and groups and Al Qaeda in Iraq and all this other stuff. But then the tribal awakening happens, and they renege. And because, again, the Islamic State had, the thing I didn't know before was that they played fast and loose with associates and smaller groups that even contract stuff out, give people money and say, go do attacks on the Americans or whatever, or the Iraqis. And but once you joined, you joined, and they killed 4 senior leaders of the Mujahideen army. That's what the Wali decided. It's really well within their Takfir ideology. So he's just doing what the organization told him to do. And yet they stack him for it, probably just to mitigate some fallout. So there's still all of this it's still a black hole. Like, what is happening between the Islamic State and all of its rival groups? And out of that, I think that's how al-Mala ends up being the deputy wali, because they sacked the security emir who probably did the killing, and they sacked the wali himself. And either he didn't have permission to do what he was doing from the higher or what. But this is another problem the Islamic State has. They're decentralized insurgency, but they really want to be able to weigh in on consequential political killings like this. And so that whole discussion with Syria and on all the different other rival groups. And I think these are things al-Mala had to weigh in on as the Sharia when he was the Sharia and when he was the deputy, is the legality of kind of inner resistance rivalry stuff. And that was really critical, obviously, during the awakening / surge period, which the Islamic State's under a lot of pressure at this point.
And Craig, there were similar problems with Ansar al-Sunnah, which can you explain that as well? Tom preempted my question with that. That's why, Tom, when you see me laughing,
there's another incident where Ansar al-Sunnah has actually killed 2 suspected Iraqi policemen, and it turns out they're actually insurgents, which is a story in and of itself, I'm sure,
yeah,
but
sure.
not a unique one. But it turns out one of them's an Islamic State person, the other one belongs to the Islamic Army, and so they have a big Sharia kind of they have a Shura council about it. And al-Mala's in it, and he's the one, trying to get retribution for the killing of their soldier, and so is the Islamic Army. But it's Ansar al-Sunnah who does it, and they're the ones who are very, ideologically identical almost to the Islamic State, except they won't join them for a variety of reasons. Eventually do by 2014, I think. Eventually joined the Islamic State, but certainly. It's an interesting story.
In fact, on the Ansar al-Sunnah, one of the things we've been documenting in the Bin Laden files is that, Ansar al-Sunnah and its emirs are constantly complaining about the Islamic State of Iraq to al-Qaeda senior leadership. And the response from al-Qaeda senior leadership is, you should just join with your brothers, basically want to resolve these issues. But they're not taking Ansar al-Sunnah's side in the fight against the Islamic State of Iraq, although they're hearing them out. But what's interesting about that is that a lot of the objections Ansar al-Sunnah is raising during this period are the problems that arise that actually come back to bite al-Qaeda senior leadership, in the 2013-2014 period. Ansar al-Sunnah, basically, if you look back to their files and their letters and everything they were saying, they basically have the right to say, "We told you so," essentially, Now some of those guys are dead now, or captured, but, they basically were complaining about the same types of problems that end up boiling over and becoming central to sort of the al-Qaeda rivalry.
Yeah, I think so, but it's almost like the larger al-Qaeda Islamic State rivalry. There's a lot of, they're blaming each other for stuff that each other is doing anyways. Ansar al-Sunnah in this particular case is killing Iraqi policemen. Well, what's their major complaint with the Islamic State at the time? Killing Iraqi Sunnis. Right. And they're all doing the same thing. And you can understand the frustration for al-Qaeda, which is, they're trying to get these people to work together. And especially the ideologues that, the Salafis, at least, let's get the Salafis together. The true Salafi jihadists, let's put it that way, because, there's varying degrees of Salafi even in Iraq. Sure. And at the end of the day, they couldn't do it, which I think shows the real failures of their ability to get 2 very similar groups together. And the Islamic State, I think they tried very hard to get Ansar al-Sunnah on board, but it was always going to be their way. And I think the Ansar al-Sunnah leadership was like, no, we're not. We were the original ones. I think it was a little bit of a jihadi pride thing. We were the first ones here. We were the ones who helped Zarqawi when he came into Iraq. Yeah. He stole our guys from us and started what became a larger, more powerful organization. And they just have difficulty at the end dealing with it. And the U.S. helps because I think in 2007, we capture their leader and release him under the promise that he'll look at reconciling with the Iraqi government. I think it was al-Shafi. Yep. And it's a pretty famous story of turning an insurgent. But that splits the organization, because half of Ansar al-Sunnah is like, we can't negotiate with the Iraqi government, we're Salafi jihadists, and the other half's like, well, maybe we should, and it kind of just it goes downhill for them after that. But it does take a few years.
But
again, al-Mala is like right at the center of this again, just weirdly, he's in the middle of this historical dispute, and he's well placed to kind of inform the Islamic State on how to deal with these rivals throughout this period and into the future, and even now. And
Yeah,
that's
it's
all
interesting.
soon it's still around,
Yeah, some of the Shafi correspondence that made its way through to Bin Laden's compound, we've been processing that, and it's sort of some interesting how that was all working out, because one of the guys who was funneling the stuff back and forth to Bin Laden, of course, was T. Abdel Rahman, his longtime right-hand man, who was, according to the Treasury Department, and we know from other sources, was the primary liaison for Al-Qaeda to Iran. And so some of this time, as you can see in the files, Rahman's in Iran passing the stuff, must have been a very uncomfortable sort of situation, And there's a funny anecdote on that, too, we're going to get to eventually on Rahman basically saying, Al-Qaeda at one point goes to try and turn up the pressure on Iran. And there's some funny letters from Rahman saying basically, whoa, okay, hey, I'm confused here, and basically the subtext, if you know the details are, he was in Iran and was worried that, basically they're, if he turned up too much, he's going to get caught in the crossfire, but of course it didn't happen. But there's a lot more to that story too. But, I'm just going through all this, so you see they're structured between the left and the right, or the west and the east of Mosul. And then they have sectors within that even. So it's not just the left and right, but they also have the north and south sectors. And I'm just curious, do we know how much of this sort of infrastructure, like you said, Craig, that this basically evolved over time? Of course, it's constantly changing, but is this sort of the same general architecture you think was in place basically when they declare the Caliphate in 2014, or something similar to that in Mosul, or was it sort of just totally different by that point in time?
Yeah, they use the left. I've seen, I'm working on the ISIS files over at GW, looking at the Department of Soldiers, like their actual, their DOD version. And it's pretty complex, but they assign units. They might even assign the same division to do both sides of the river. But different brigades one's a left side unit, one's a right side unit, and they must be under the control of those sector leaders, as they call it, the sector. And then those fall under. It's unclear whether they fall under like the Nineveh Wali or the actual Department of Soldiers Emir. And I think the Emir is more like I think they almost have a structure like the U.S. military, where the Department of Soldiers Emir just is worried about, soldier training, man training, equip issues. And the Wali is really in charge of defending his particular area. And so, yeah, but I mean, they haven't really, the boundaries seem to have changed a lot over time based off of conditions, but generally they're kind of sector, region, city, and those kind of things, and eventually provinces, which came about, I think, in 2007. It's kind of a long transition, 2007, 2008, and then, but those are all pretty much the same.
Craig, there was one individual mentioned in this document. His name was Abu Khazara. He was killed by the United States in 2008, and at the time he was identified as being a Swedish citizen. He's also Moroccan, and he was said to be in charge of the northern region area. That's a quote from Mala. It was later determined that he was the. I'm sorry. The U.S. military said that Khazara had also trained in camps in Pakistan and Afghanistan in the 1990s. What can you tell us about him additionally from these documents, and what else do you know about Abu Khazara? He's definitely an interesting character. To see someone like him rise. He eventually became the deputy emir, at least the U.S. military claimed was the deputy emir of the Islamic State of Iraq at the time as well. So is there anything else you could tell us about him and what from the files?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult for us to try to figure out who some of the folks are that Al-Mala was talking about, but it's completely clear who he's talking about when he's talking about Abu Khazara. All of the nicknames actually match up with Abu Khazara because he named Abu Sara, Abu Jassim, and Abu Khazara. So he gives all three of his kunyas, and then tells the U.S. military, who he probably suspects already knows, that he's a foreigner and he's not sure where he's from, but he speaks with a different language. He speaks with a different accent, an Arabic, but not with an Iraqi accent. He is not from Iraq, and he's not from the local area. And so definitely identifying him as a foreign fighter, traveler, if you will. So and that's his boss's boss. So whether he was, when he was the deputy wali, or even just the head Sharia of Mosul, which he was for a longer period of time during this kind of year that he's with the Islamic State before he's detained, roughly a year. And so he gets captured in early 2008, and within a few months of his capture, Qaswara is hunted down and killed by the U.S. military. So it's impossible. I mean, a lot of people were captured about that same time period as him, and they probably all might have given up Qaswara as well. But there's that's the possibility that it was Maula's identification. Just kind of help paint a picture that the U.S. military were already suspected. They knew who Abu Qaswara was. And as far as him being the second in command, there's a joke, and I'm sure you've probably told it 1,000 times, Bill.
Al Qaeda's number 3?
Number 2, number 3. Yeah. I don't think that's how any of that worked. Right. So he was the northern region, though, and that's what I was saying. They were trying to figure out ways to manage, the insurgency in different ways. And I've seen as early as 2006 them having that northernish kind of emir, but I think again it goes back to they have structure, but it's constantly fluid and it's fluctuating. And so they had somebody who was roughly in charge of the north. They had definitely someone in charge of the south of Baghdad, and then people in the center, and then out west. And they kind of had it that way. But I think obviously when things fall apart in the south, Anbar gets flipped pretty hard with a heavy tribal influence there compared to other places, and then they get booted out of Diyala and in late 2007, early 2008. You can imagine that the northern emir is the guy. So I mean, I can understand why people called him the number 2, because he's probably the most influential regional emir in the Islamic State at the time, and to the point where again they're sticking centralized resources under not him, because he's probably just a few people. They probably didn't have a robust northern region, command, if you will. But certainly, Mosul was pretty robust, as you can see from the documents. Mosul's very, very robust.
I mean, one of the things Bill and I have talked about a lot, and I was curious to get your perspective on this, and it's sort of speculative, but that's okay. It's our podcast, so we can speculate, Craig. And that's what we can do here. We talked for years about, and you've been following this too, so you know the dynamic. The U.S. kills or captures top leadership in these organizations. Somebody else pops up. Now, it's not that the killing and capture of high-value targets doesn't matter. It does matter. It creates disruptions in communication, disruptions in leadership. Obviously, I think you could argue that fueled the rivalry between Al Qaeda and the Islamic State in some ways. I think they probably contributed to it. And you can point to other disruptions. The Pakistani Taliban, we've covered them as another case study. Their last leader was a real dud, we think, and that was caused a lot of problems for them in the turnover. So obviously, targeting their senior leadership has mattered there. But what do you think now about the Islamic State of Islamic State? From the Islamic State of Iraq to now, you have Mullah now as the new emir. What do you think about him in terms of everything you can gather? And of course, this is somewhat speculative, but again, we're having a little fun here. What do you think in terms of his? If you go through the chain of succession now, the Islamic State of Iraq, you had Abu Amr al-Baghdadi with Abu Hamza as his right-hand man. You had Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and now you've got really the third emir after the declaration of the Islamic State. You've got the third emir. What do you think of this guy in terms of his abilities, in terms of where he's coming from and how he compares to his predecessor?
Yeah, it's hard. It's a little bit hard to tell. I think he's a pretty careful person just from listening. He's an opportunist and a pragmatist. You can see that from his interrogations. Once he realizes that the U.S. military knows a little bit about his organization, or when they lay out the exact number of people to this
he
particular
stops pretending
layer,
to be a Sufi. He stops pretending to be a Sufi.
Yeah, he realizes that his impression of the American military.
This is not a reader of Rumi. He's just not a reader of Rumi. He's not reading, poetry in a way that is sort of the more spiritual nature of Islam. He's got a very different view of it than sort of the Sufis. I
mean, just the way he kind of jumps into the organization, and it seems like it's not a culture shock to him. He's making decisions. And he talks about those. He talks about his role in the early on. I haven't seen him pop up a lot since, but that's not much different than Abu Bakr in the sense like he was not a real somebody until they made him. And so.
But that goes to a point you gave earlier, which I want to reemphasize here, because you just made it again in a different way, I think, which is that this is not built on a cult of personality. That this is not how these guys are built, which is very interesting because it comes to the charisma argument when it comes to leadership of all this. I always thought that's a little bit misplaced. I mean, I think there's some truth to that when it came to bin Laden, some truth to it, but overall, when you look at how these organizations tick, as you said, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was not exactly giving, lengthy sermons before he was named Caliph. He wasn't a guy who was well known on the street. He's not a guy who, is going to be out there inspiring others just by his words or, his appearances. That wasn't him at all. He very rarely spoke on audio messages. And then one of his few, he gave his video appearance. I think it was his first video appearance is when he gives from the pulpit in the Mosul, right? In the mosque of Mosul. I mean, that's the first time we ever saw him is then. So it's not like charisma was really the drawing factor with him at all. And you can see the Islamic State, we follow them obviously in all their media to this day, and they're still, they've taken a lot of setbacks, but they are still functioning. They are still humming along in some areas. And they're, they've had a lot of declarations of allegiance or pledges of bayah to the new emir. So it's not you can't say it's a charisma thing because this guy hasn't spoken publicly at all, right? As far as we could tell, no audio or video messages from him whatsoever.
Yeah, the last one was the spokesman again. I mean, they're almost going for an anti-charisma model. The way we understand it, I know my partner Herrera and I think a lot about leadership succession, not necessarily about the leader targeting, like you said. I mean, the leader, and we think there's a little bit of a misperception that you have to be charismatic to hold an insurgent organization together. It almost is very intuitive, like, well, this is a decentralized organization, you need to have something. But the charisma they needed, Zarqawi gave them, and then once he was dead, he served the purpose, and they're able to transition to much more what they call routinized, which means you have a much more normal leader who's very subdued, and it's all about the rules and the traditions within the organization and the bureaucracies. And, they weigh in occasionally, but, as you saw, Abu Bakr, very boring, and then they if they want excitement, they can just pipe in Zarqawi speeches in the background of their videos, and that just fires people up naturally, and will continue to do so until this organization completely disappears, if that ever happens. Hopefully it does. But they don't need that from their leaders. So we haven't seen al-Mawla. He probably is. They're probably keeping him alive. They really need to keep him alive because he is that continuity. But at the same time, he's got the title, and he'll weigh in when he needs to. But otherwise, they kind of have a brain trust of people who all kind of have the same experiences now, all fought the Americans. They have different skill sets, whether it's managing economic stuff or crime or the religious stuff. So he's going to be kind of responsible, even though he's not a high level cleric as you would imagine or that exists in the Islamic world. It's going to be good enough for the Islamic State. More importantly, he understands the Islamic State's theology, right? Their distinct spin on a theology, and he's been in the Sharia since the beginning of the state structure, at least, and so he's got all that credibility. So they'll want to keep him alive, minimize his risk, and then let everybody else, his lieutenants, do all the stuff. And that's where the number 2 of Al-Qaeda joke comes in again, right? Like, those are the people who are going to take the risk. And there's probably a few that are going to be Qurayshis who have some kind of documented Qurayshi tie who are sitting in that bench in case he gets found. And then they'll go through this whole thing again. But it's almost a battle drill for them now. And they've got it down. I mean, the impressive thing and the scary thing at the same time is, they lost Abu Bakr. He wasn't charismatic, but he's still their first Caliph, and he, the Mosul and the triumph and all the victory stuff, and then you lose him the way you do at a very critical time at the end of the Caliphate period where it kind of goes down. And the question is, do your affiliates stay with you? And they did, because they've kind of built this. It's not the Caliph, it's the position, right? It's not the Caliph, it's the Caliph, right? If that makes any sense whatsoever. It's not the person who's the Caliph, it's the position of the Caliph. And yes, you're going to pay individual allegiance to him, but it's just not about that particular person.
I'll give you one more question on this, and then Bill's got a question for you, and
Well, Tom, can I jump in here because it follows right on the charisma?
Yeah,
point.
go right for it.
Yeah, and Craig, I could not agree with you anymore. I think this idea that it's a very Western idea that a leadership of an insurgency or of any group whatsoever needs to be charismatic. I mean, look, Zawahiri, right? He's 9 years. He's probably one of the most uncharismatic people, at least according to Westerners, that we'll find. And yet not a single Al-Qaeda organization defected when Osama bin Laden was killed. Look, I look at someone like Siraj Haqqani, who's one of two deputy emirs of the Taliban, probably considered one of the most charismatic figures within the jihadist world, and we have one photograph of him. I think there's maybe one or two recordings of his out there on record. Maybe there's 4 or 5. They're charismatic in a way that we as Westerners don't understand. They're charismatic based on their actions, based on their deeds, based on their beliefs. That's what appeals to the jihadist, in my opinion, and not this Che Guevara type charisma that we think is required to lead a jihadist insurgency.
Yeah, but if you look at like the leadership targeting or decapitation literature in academia, the one of the operating assumptions is that you have to you're charismatic if you're a leader of these kind of organizations, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, we talked a little bit about this with Ambassador Brown, Edmund Fenton Brown, was on our last episode of the podcast. One of the things about Zawahiri that people miss in terms of the charisma point is that he's not trying to do the hothead propaganda that ISIS puts out that gets the youth all motivated. That's not, as the nerd who sat through probably every Zawahiri lecture at this point, and I have sat through them all, right, or virtually all of them, right. They are boring. They are boring, but they are. But he's having a philosophical or religious debate with people throughout the Islamic world, so to speak, who disagree with him. Like look in 9/11 in 2019, he's very angry that people still, a lot of sheikhs and scholars disagree with 9/11. So he wants to have that argument. Now it's a boring argument in a lot of ways for us to listen to or try and summarize, but it is the argument he's trying to have. But let's. I got one last point for you, and maybe we can wrap it up. And we got to have you on again. Again, you've got a standing invitation. You're one of the few. Doc, anytime you want to come on and talk about anything, anytime you want to come on and talk about anything, you can come on. But Mala, I mean, there's been some talk about ISIS and Al Qaeda. We don't see any evidence that ISIS is willing to reconcile with Al Qaeda at this point. Mala is the new Caliph now, so to speak, and he, as you said, he solicited all those pledges of allegiance to him from all the provinces. They've got that structure in place. In some places they're stronger than others, of course. There's an ebb and flow to all this. We got all the caveats, right? But, what do you think about this guy? I mean, he doesn't strike me. I mean, again, this is speculation, so I have absolutely zero intelligence here. But just looking through all this and going through everything, how the Islamic State has reacted after Baghdadi's death now, and knowing a little bit about this guy from these files and from other evidence and from what's happened here, he doesn't strike me as a guy who wants to sort of have a come to terms with Al Qaeda at this point, or Zawahiri or anybody else along the lines. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean that's a great angle I hadn't really thought of. Is what would his I know there's certain pretty influential folks talking about that being a possibility, and I do think it could be a possibility. And I would say this guy is pretty pragmatic, and I still don't think we really know what Abu Bakr was really about. Like, people try to tell us what they thought about him, or he was this or that.
Yeah, you had to do a lot of deduction. You just had to.
I have no idea. I'll tell you, I have no idea. And I've read as much as I could on him and thought about him a lot, but I have no idea what he was really like. But I got the feeling that was always going to be an impossibility under Abu Bakr, right? Like, I just got that feeling. And either that or Adnani was out on his own. But, again, Abu Bakr was boring, but he had that attack dog in Adnani.
Sure.
Who was, who went after Al Qaeda and had the chops to do it, who went after other jihadi rivals, and who went after the United States and Europe and everybody else, and did external ops. And I mean, but with him gone, it'd be interesting. Mohammed Al Furqan is also, again, I'll go back to the brain trust as a crutch on this answer and say, the brain trust gets to decide, and they for better or for worse for them, I think they rely on this group decision making process a little bit more than we might understand.
Mm-hmm.
And because they got to live with it, they all have to live with it, right? They're all subject to the same kind of sanctions there if they're wrong. And so, Mohammed al-Furqan, who is kind of one of the geniuses behind the Islamic State, and you're really hard to find anything on him. He's the media, he's the genius behind the media.
Yep.
But he was also a hardliner from a lot of the leaked, dissenters talked about. And so he's gone. He was killed in a drone strike 2016. Mohammed al-Anani's gone also in 2016. There was a double decapitation on the media department, which is also where two of these bigwigs were. And obviously Abu Bakr being dead. I think Mao's got a little bit. I don't see why he would do it, to be honest. But I mean, I think there's more of a chance of it happening than before. Let's put it that way. That might still be a low possibility. And so that, and you never know. You never know what's going on.
You got the heart of the question, basically. We don't know. I mean, I said this is all speculative because we don't know. I mean, what the hell? We don't know. There's all sorts of communications between these guys that come to light after the fact, and we don't know what's going on behind the scenes right now, But you actually came right to the point that Bill and I have nerded out about a bunch of times, which is, a lot of these guys' Islamic State's hierarchy have been killed. And they were central to the rivalry. We thought that basically if that had happened earlier in the process, there may have been more of a ability for reconciliation early on, but sort of, if you look through sort of what they're putting out as an institution throughout the Islamic State, there's a lot of anti-Al-Qaeda messaging to this day. And I gotta believe that has sunk in to a certain extent institutionally across the board, that it's not something but again, we don't know. I mean, you don't know if they're going to have a turnabout on this stuff, going forward, or somebody's going to, have a change of opinion. But Mala, to me, I look through this guy's stuff and, I don't know. We don't know enough about him to really know what he thinks about all that. He hasn't actually commented on any of this stuff, publicly at all, or at all publicly comment on anything. So we don't really know.
Yeah, and that's not unusual. Again, Abu Bakr did not. He made a speech after a year, and it was Osama bin Laden's eulogy, and it was very short and perfunctory. Yeah. And
although he did say we translated and retranslated it several times in that speech, he did say basically that you have faithful men here in Iraq to Zawahiri, which was one of the indications that he was, because there was the whole idea that Islamic State of Iraq was out of the Al-Qaeda fold as of 2006. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that that's wrong, but that speech, which was the eulogy for bin Laden, was very much within the Al-Qaeda fold of speech, and there's actually one document, by the way, and I'll leave you on this thought. Actually, this whole episode is reminding me that I've got stuff I've got to send you from bin Laden's compound that I need your help processing, and I don't know what the hell is wrong with me that I haven't sent to you yet. I got a bunch of audio files. We got to get you working on this stuff and get your team working on it because we're trying to expand the pool of people looking at that stuff. But there's one file where it mentions that, basically Baghdadi had been selected and that the message had come in from Iraq. Do we want him to be the temporary emir or do we want to sort of pass off on it? It's an interesting message. It's very provocative, actually. We're going to get back to that at some point. But, I guess anything else to add here, Craig or Bill? We'll leave it here for our listeners.
Yeah, I'll just follow up. I think a lot of the attention that gets given to whether these two major groups merge misses the fact that these groups never really merge. They do. They all start off as mergers, right? But then once honeymoon periods are over on these mergers, the Islamic State's collected groups over its lifestyle, but usually those are independent groups. What I think you've seen, like with going back to Ansar al-Sunnah, is that it's individual defections that tell you the real story of what's going on. A lot of the Islamic State's early leadership came from Ansar al-Sunnah. That gave the bad blood between them. Obviously, Islamic State comes from Al-Qaeda. So, at some point, the bad blood becomes pretty, unsurmountable. And I think that's where you're at on that. And so it'd be interesting to see. I think one of the organizations have to be in complete crisis for something like that to happen, which is what happens to Ansar al-Sunnah. They go into complete crisis and say, okay, fine, we'll just join you. And that's only locally. And then not everybody did that. The Kurds really just went their own way and end up in Syria.
Yeah, you still have an Ansar al-Islam faction today in Syria, which is still aligned with the Al-Qaeda factions. Although the Syria stuff, we're not getting off on that right now because that's just a total mess to try and tease out what the heck's going on there. Bill, you got anything else? Or
no. just to thank you for joining us, Craig. It's always a pleasure. We look forward to having you back on again. It's just we could take 2 hours and do this, but thank you for your hour.
Yeah, thanks for your time, and get after the documents. Anyone who's interested, they're right there on the CTC website. Pretty easy to find, and pretty fascinating. Won't take too long.
No, and that was a great service. I think anytime we get stuff out to the public, we're big fans of transparency on all this stuff, and it needs to be done across the board. And we're very thankful for you coming on the podcast, Craig, once again, and also for all the work you do on these issues, which we think are crucial. And again, you have a standing invitation, but you can take us up on that at any time you want. But thank you to our audience again for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. And we will see you again next week.